Welcome to Marquis Mondays, a webinar series that features various authors who have written books related to the Marquis de Lafayette. Tonight, we travel to France and meet the women of Chateau Lafayette with our featured author, Stephanie Dray, who is a New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and U.S. Today best-selling author of historical women's fiction. Her award-winning work has been translated into many languages and tops lists for the most anticipated reads of the year. She now lives in Maryland with her husband, cats, and history books. And so it is our honor to welcome Stephanie Dray to our broadcast. Stephanie, welcome.
Thank you for having me. Oh, I'm so honored to be here with you today. I want to thank you for welcoming me, not just as a writer, but as a reader and a history lover who's always looking back in order to better understand where we are now and how we got here. Now, you might know me from some of my historical novels that I've written before, including America's First Daughter, My Dear Hamilton, Ribbons of Scarlet, and of course, The Women of Chateau Lafayette. And in each of these books, the Marquis de Lafayette appears, sometimes only briefly, but always meaningfully as a kind of guardian angel. In fact, my next book is going to be about Abigail Adams, and he showed up in that book too, so I cannot escape the Marquis. This revolutionary hero has a habit of showing up in my stories when my heroines need him most. Just as he had a habit of showing up in history when Americans needed him most. And to be honest, I think we need him again today, which is why I'm delighted that this year we're all celebrating the anniversary of his farewell tour. And in case you didn't know, Lafayette was invited by President James Monroe to return to the United States, not on a diplomatic mission or as a soldier, but to be the guest of the nation. President Monroe was one of the last of the founding generation, and he was really worried about the future of the United States. George Washington was gone, Hamilton and Franklin were dead, Jefferson and Adams were fading, and the national memory of what united us as Americans was starting to fade too. The Constitution was young, but, many of the veterans were now elderly. They were, limping with injuries or living in poverty. Slavery was still gripping half the country. Relations were not great with Native Americans either. And women were still without legal or political voice. The wounds of the war hadn't healed, and we were deeply divided. Enter Lafayette. And from the moment he set foot on American soil, the country lost its collective mind. There was bells and cannons and cheering crowds, and babies were named after him. Towns, renamed streets and parks, and even entire cities in his honor. And he visited all 24 states of the still young republic. Can you imagine 13 months of parades and dinners and speeches and just sort of spontaneous outpourings? And he was treated like a living monument. And in a way he was, but Lafayette was not a marble statue. He was a person. He listened, he laughed, he hugged old comrades, he praised school kids, and he didn't just visit generals that he used to know. He visited widows of his fallen comrades. He visited Native American leaders, printing presses, orphanages. He made a point of honoring the people who quietly built the nation, not just its politicians, but its citizens. And I think it's because he did not believe that the country should be frozen just the way it was in 1776. He didn't want his farewell tour to be just a nostalgic love fest. He took it upon himself to make it a moment of national reflection, to remind people that the American Revolution wasn't just an event, but a promise of a better world, of equality and justice. And that's why Lafayette acknowledged enslaved peoples on his travels. He spoke often of abolition and of women's rights, And he even challenged old friends like Thomas Jefferson to ask if this great nation he bled for was living up to its promise. Had it really been worth the sacrifice? And Lafayette, of all people, he had the right to ask. And people loved him in spite of his questions and sometimes because of those questions. But to understand why Americans loved him so deeply, we have to rewind about 50 years, where most of my books are set during the American Revolution. Now, actually, before the American Revolution, Lafayette was born in France, which was a monarchy with a rigid hierarchy and a state religion. And most of the tax burden was actually on the peasants, not on the nobles or the clergy. And as for human rights, the peasants had next to none. If you had a lot of money, you got away with a lot. And if you didn't, you could be nabbed and thrown into jail on very little pretext. You could also be tortured or even killed with very few protections. People in France at this time were often married off young, and they couldn't get a divorce even if this was an abusive situation. And there was some, but not a lot, of social mobility. Even if you were a brilliant entrepreneur, if you were born into the peasant class, your chances of improving your life with hard work were not good. With While the nobles, meanwhile, many of them even well-intentioned nobles, they were playing games in the gilded halls at Versailles while the peasants were literally starving. And that is the world in which uh, the Marquis de Lafayette was born. Now, his family did not spend a lot of time in Versailles. Though they were noble, they were considered country bumpkins. But then, through a series of odd and tragic events, Lafayette inherited a lot of money. And when I say a lot of money, I mean that he became one of the richest people in all of France. And suddenly, he was a real catch on the noble marriage mark. So it was time for him to, go to Versailles and learn how to be a courtier and bow to the king and all the king's brothers, and he hated doing this. So at just 19, he defied his king. He snuck out of France, bought his own ship, sailed across the Atlantic to fight for American independence. He sailed for America not because he had to, but because the cause of liberty and the hope of a better world compelled him. Um, Now, I don't know about you, but at 19, I couldn't be trusted to balance my own checkbook, much less hold a military command during a revolution. But Lafayette, he distinguished himself. He won George Washington's trust and affection, even sort of becoming the general's adopted son. He secured crucial support from France, and it's no exaggeration to say that the United States would not have earned independence without him. Um, After the war was won, Lafayette took those ideas back to France. He helped write the French Declaration of Rights, which ended up leading to the French Revolution, where things took a dark turn. And Lafayette's ideas cost him dearly. He suffered betrayal and imprisonment and exile, but he never lost his faith. And because of that, he became a legend in his own lifetime. And all of that would be enough to justify a book about him and about the women in his life. It really would have been. But that it wasn't Lafayette that really made me want to write The Women of Chateau Lafayette. It's because I realized that his remarkable journey wasn't one that he walked alone. It was profoundly shaped by the women at his side, especially his wife Adrienne, whose quiet courage would become an essential part of his story. Adrienne was only 13 when they got married. This was an arranged match that grew into love. Adrienne became not just his wife, she became a co-revolutionary. His ideals were hers, and she suffered for them too. Lafayette and Adrienne both believed that freedom was incomplete without dignity and justice for every person, regardless of race, creed, nationality, or circumstance. Adrienne is a woman who would go and visit prisoners, advocating for their humane treatment. She eventually took over Lafayette's project of purchasing plantations in an effort to free the enslaved people on them. She also fostered and educated a Native American child who had been brought to France. So Adrienne's commitment to American ideals wasn't just sentiment, it was lived out daily in her household. And when I realized that, I thought, oh, this is our French founding mother who never set foot on our soil, and I would love to write about her. So, another thing that really inspired me about her is that while Lafayette was fighting with his sword overseas and even at home, Adrienne was the one managing their estates, raising their children, navigating revolutionary France. And she did so bravely, guided by her ideals of compassion and human dignity. Now, what was her reward for all that? Well, it was losing nearly everyone that she loved during the French Revolution. Her mother, her grandmother, and her sister died under the guillotine. She was imprisoned herself and came within a hair's breadth of the guillotine, were it not for the intercession of American diplomats, most especially including James Monroe and his wife Elizabeth. And so this was sort of already an operatic story that really attracts a historical fiction writer. But what really sealed the deal for me is that when Adrienne finally was released from prison and she could have escaped to safety, instead, she traveled across dangerous territory with her daughters to voluntarily join her husband in an Austrian prison. Can you imagine the courage that that took? A woman who was already weakened from her own imprisonment and grief of losing her family, crossing enemy territory, and then locking herself willingly behind bars for love. She nursed Lafayette physically and emotionally, and she saved his life. And when she died, too young, it was almost assuredly because of what she suffered from joining him in that imprisonment. And so Lafayette mourned her daily, carrying her portrait everywhere. And I just thought that was so romantic. And it was such an operatic story. And this was a level of physical and emotional and mental courage that I hadn't seen even in the stories of other amazing women that I have written about. So I knew that if Lafayette was the hero of Two Worlds, his wife Adrienne had been the heroine of Two Worlds. She was our French founding mother who sacrificed for us without ever coming here. What Lafayette became, his empathy, his endurance, his belief in liberty, humanity, and compassion, that was forged in that marriage. And as a novelist, that really inspired me to write The Women of Chateau Lafayette. But it was more than just their love story. What captivated me was how their legacy kept echoing forward through the ages. When I first learned about the chateau in Chavignac, the modest stone castle in Auvergne where Lafayette was born, I was imagining a quaint historic site, sort of frozen in time. I did not expect that this place would become the backdrop for some of the most extraordinary acts of courage in modern history. And for this, you have to go now from the Revolution in France to World War I. During the Great War, an American socialite, actress, and sculptor named Beatrice Chandler stumbled on the chateau. She didn't go there as a tourist. She went as a woman on a mission. She was already raising money for orphans and for soldiers through the Lafayette Fund. And when she saw the disrepair of Lafayette's birthplace, she bought the property. She restored it and she turned it into a haven for displaced children during the war. But Beatrice didn't just, open her checkbook and walk away. She personally crossed the Atlantic, organizing drives, meeting with donors, petitioning officials, becoming the public face of the American humanitarian effort during the war, invoking Lafayette's name to inspire Americans to help. She reminded people that Lafayette had risked everything for American liberty, and now it was time for America to return the favor and make the world safe for democracy. She actually became a decorated war heroine because she crossed the Atlantic more than any other aid work during that war. That would be an amazing enough story that Lafayette's their legacy continued into the Great War. But the story didn't end there. 2 decades later, as World War II swept across Europe, that chateau once again became a refuge, and this time it was to hide Jewish children who were fleeing Nazi persecution. France was occupied, the Gestapo was hunting down families, and in that same castle where Lafayette had once dreamed of liberty, caretakers were risking their lives to shelter the innocent. And there were hidden compartments, forged papers, underground resistance. At least one of the teachers there trained children to answer to fake names and tried to smuggle them out. So every time I thought that I had found the most astonishing part of the chateau's history, I uncovered something else, something true, something really brave. And it was always women that were at the center of the story. Women like Adrienne and Beatrice and the caretakers of the chateau. They reminded me that people don't need to wield swords or wear uniforms to be heroes. Sometimes bravery looks like a warm meal cooked for children or slipping a forged document past a checkpoint or a woman like Lafayette's wife who stood up to power and refused to obey. And that's the story that I wanted to tell in the Women of Chateau Lafayette. It's why I believe that the chateau isn't just a historical footnote. For me, it's a sacred place. It's a real world monument to idealism in action and a reminder that the Lafayette legacy was never just his. It belonged to everyone who fought to keep it alive. Which brings me to this moment and all of you, because Lafayette's story didn't just live in that castle in France, and it isn't just commemorated in the lives of the women that I wrote about in this novel, women who I still revere. It also lives on in the choices that we make today and the values that we pass on, the stories that we choose to preserve. When Lafayette returned to the United States on his tour, it wasn't about him, which is strange to think because, of course, it was also about him. But what he wanted us to do is to remember how we got this far and where we still needed to go as a nation. It was about us and it was about the future. And Lafayette didn't return to America just to bask in glory. He returned to reignite a flame, which is a theme that shows up again and again in my book. He wanted to hold up a mirror to Americans and ask, are we still the nation that we were meant to be? And that question is a question every generation of Americans has to ask itself, including our own. Um, I always remember that Lafayette kept working for liberty in his own country, even when he knew that he might never live to see it. He worked for decades towards legal reforms and trying to make a constitutional monarchy that would protect human rights. He watched governments fall and rise again and again, and yet he still held on to hope when I would imagine any other person would have long given in to despair. But Lafayette understood something that I personally found deeply poignant, and I tried to really emphasize in my book. And that is that the work that we do today may not change our own lives, but it may echo across centuries. Other people may pick up the torch and carry it forward. And that's what I showed in the book. So I hope we remember that, the work of liberty is never really finished. It wasn't finished when Lafayette returned in 1824. It wasn't finished when the chateau sheltered children in the world wars. It's not finished now. And Lafayette really believed in us. We're the stewards of his legacy. So I feel like we should do what he did, that we should protect what matters, knowledge and history and freedom, and pass it forward. So I hope that if you enjoyed my book, that you will share it with others, that you will recommend that others learn about Lafayette and the legacy that endures, because that's how we preserve knowledge and history and that memory. Um, Now, I'm just going to talk a wee little bit about the research that came behind this book. Because of all the books that I've written, this one took the longest. It actually took me 7 years in all, even though, just as a caveat, I want you to know I was writing other books during that time. So it wasn't just 7 consecutive years, but there was a lot of research involved. Um, I knew that I would have to go to France. Oh, the horrors, you know. It's wonderful when you get to go to France to do research. And so I was really excited to go. Um, we started out in Paris, and I stayed at St. James Albany, which is the last remnant of the Hotel de Noailles, which is Adrienne Lafayette's ancestral home. And I was really excited to stay there, both because I knew this is where a young Lafayette and his wife got married and spent the early years of their marriage. But also, I knew that Beatrice Chandler had stayed in that exact same hotel, and for the same reasons I was staying there. So I got to walk in the footsteps of my heroines, and that was very moving for me. I get very emotional at historical sites. And so I had a lot of fun in Paris visiting places that I knew the Lafayettes would have gone. I also visited the conciergerie where people were beheaded, um, or at least held before they were beheaded. Then we took a bullet train to Lyon and drove up into the mountains of Auvergne. And this was a long trek. I was surprised because it made me think, if this is a little bit arduous for me using planes, trains, and automobiles, I can only imagine how difficult it was for Lafayette to get to us in America on carriage and boat and horse. Or how difficult it must have been for Adrienne, because she traversed a great deal of France by foot during the French Revolution, after she had been released from prison. So once I reached the chateau, I almost passed out because it was so incredible. It is currently a museum, and I met with the people there, and I started to understand which parts of the castle had been built on afterwards by Beatrice Chandler and what her legacy was like there. And I also got to make some decisions about who my characters might be, because the third heroine in my novel is the World War II heroine, Martha Simone. And she is a compilation character. And what that means is I knew that there was a school teacher who was helping the French resistance who was in that castle during World War II, but her name is lost to history. So I had to put together the details about her that we do know and make up the rest. What was her backstory? And part of the inspiration that I found in doing that was I uncovered a photo of a young girl in braids. And she was one of the only girls in the classroom at the chateau at that time who was looking straight at the camera. And I thought, oh, there's my heroine. I like her. She looks like she has spunk and grit. So, so she became the face of the third heroine in my novel, because even though we don't know that woman's name, I felt like her accomplishments needed to be acknowledged and celebrated. So, um, I was really delighted to be able to do that. Although I wish that I, had a picture of this woman or knew what she was like. But that's where a novelist can fill in the blanks and help us understand history better. So when I was there, I loved learning about the castle and how small this town was, or village, I should say. And a lot of it is preserved. Some of the remnants from Lafayette's day have survived. There are letters between Lafayette and Napoleon, for example, that are preserved in his treasure room. And there's a lot of Masonic symbols that are still there because he was a Freemason. So I really enjoyed that. But I had wanted to see the secret tunnels that I had read about, where Adrian had hid her son and where the Jewish children had theoretically been hidden during the war. And when I asked about it, the guides were not able to show me. And that might have been a language barrier, I'm not sure. But I came to the conclusion that it must just be a myth, that it wasn't true. And so I came back to America thinking that the story was going to be a lot more conservative than it truly was. But then I stopped at the New York Historical Society and I was looking through the papers of Beatrice Chandler. And amongst the amazing discoveries that I made there were some photos of the chateau, of the secret tunnels, and she had very helpfully labeled them secret tunnels. So that helped out a great deal. I was very excited about that. And so that's wonderful to be able to bring into history that yes, this did exist. Another thing that I got to bring into history through the papers and the research was the real identity of Beatrice Chandler. And I accidentally stumbled 100-year-old secret love affair. How? This is how. So when I had begun the book, I thought I knew everything there was to know about Beatrice Chandler, that she had an unhappy marriage at the beginning of World War I, but that she did stay with her husband. So it seemed to me that the story was obvious, that the war had brought them back together, and that was the story that I wrote. But there amongst Beatrice's papers, I found a sheaf of love letters. They were anonymous. They were sort of written in code in a cipher. And and if you only had those letters, you would not think anything of it. But I had been working with Beatrice's grandson, and he had given me her personal letters. And so when I put the two sides of the correspondence together, suddenly I was able to crack the code, and I realized these are love letters from a French soldier at the front. And so now this became um, a new story because now I realized that this is sort of a tragic love story. I know she stayed with her husband, so she didn't end up with the romantic Frenchman that she fell in love with. I had to be the one to break it to the family that, their grandma had been having an affair. And they took this pretty well because certainly her husband was not faithful, and they were legally separated. So that wasn't terrible news. But in the process of uncovering all of this, Beatrice's grandson discovered that his grandmother had been lying about her identity her entire life. And he called me to tell me what he had discovered, and it changed the whole course of the book again. And I'm not going to give it away because there might be people who are reading it, so I won't spoil it for you. But it's really one of the honors of my life to be able to contribute to the historical record about this amazing woman with original scholarship. So people sometimes think that historical fiction and maybe nonfiction or biographies are in competition. And I don't think that's true. I think that each has a different job. Biographers and nonfiction writers are trying to tell you what evidence exists. And historical fiction authors are taking the evidence and making a case for what we think happened. And we're trying to make you feel something about this history. So I hope that I have done that and that I have inspired people to learn more about the Marquis de Lafayette. And so I thank you. I'm delighted to take questions soon. And I will just kick it off by saying, Vive Lafayette.
Um, what interesting details did you discover about Lafayette and the women who lived at the chateau that didn't make it into your book?
That is a good question. Um, so one of the characters who in the novel is Emily de Legrand and her daughter Anne. And I originally thought that they would be the heroines of the novel because I thought Emily would be my World War I heroine and her daughter, who took over the chateau in World War II when she's only 24, she would be my World War II heroine. It could be a mother-daughter story with some tension there. But when I went to France and I learned a little bit more about the Lagrange family, I started to become suspicious that I realized that I could not prove that they had been on sort of the right side of history. In my heart of hearts, I believe that they were. But the Baron de Lagrange, he was a complicated fellow, and he had some anti-Semitic tendencies. And so when I learned that someone at the chateau at some point during World War II actually called the Nazis and tried to turn in some of these Jewish children who were hiding in the chateau, I could not totally rule out that it might have been Anne or Emily or one of the Lagranges. And so that really made me nervous. It made me feel like this is a period of time that's too fraught to make a mistake like that. I wouldn't want to lionize someone who maybe doesn't deserve the lionization. I also didn't want to villainize someone who ultimately may have been on the side of the angels. So I really had to change the whole vision of the book and let Beatrice shine and make Anne more of a fictional character and a more ambiguous character. So I would have loved to include all kinds of things about Anne and her husband and her adventures when she was in charge of the chateau. But ultimately, I didn't think it served the story. So, I am very grateful for the Lagrange family, and as I said, in my heart of hearts, I think they really were on the side of the angels, but I couldn't prove it, so I didn't go there.
Okay. Um, how did this book allow you to contribute to the historical records?
So I talked a little bit about my discoveries of Beatrice Chandler's identity. And that was really exciting. Her family was a little more upset about that than they were about the affair that I discovered in the records. But when I found that out, I was able to sort of build the case and share the records with the chateau itself because the museum that exists at Chavignac, they don't have access to the materials that's in the New York Historical Society and vice versa. So I was able to, let them know about these connections and the things that I had discovered about Beatrice and about the Baron and so on and so forth. And so I think now there's actually a street in Chavignac named after Beatrice, and I'm really excited about that. And, I just love the idea that America and France were able to collaborate even through me and improve the historical record on both sides of the Atlantic.
Terrific. Um, let me see here. You talked about your research,
Mhm.
but what all of a sudden made you decide to write about the women at the chateau?
Sorry about that. Um, I I well, I'll tell you a little insider secret. That's what I'll tell you to answer this question. I originally wanted to write about Adrienne Lafayette. I knew she was going to be a fabulous character, and I loved her backstory. But when I told my agent that I wanted to do this, she said, "You can't because Adrienne is not American. She's not a queen, and she didn't even get her head cut off during the French Revolution. So, so uh, this book won't sell. What I would much prefer you to do is to write about something about World War II." And I was pretty grumpy about this. And I went to a friend and I sort of complained, like, oh, well, if there was only some connection between Lafayette and the Nazis, I'd be all set. Um, but of course, I thought there couldn't possibly be any connection. But I went home and I researched, and what do you know? I did find this connection that the chateau had been the birthplace not only of Lafayette, but had then sheltered people during World War II. And I was really moved by that. And I thought, this is an amazing story. And how did this happen? And that's when I realized that Beatrice Chandler had Sorry, I keep getting phone call from a family member, and I apologize. They're the one person who can get through the focus button. So, um, when I realized that the chateau had been purchased by Beatrice Chandler, I thought to myself, I know that name from somewhere. Where do I know that name from? And I looked on my bookshelf and I found a book by Beatrice Chandler. And I thought, oh, that can't be the same person, but it was. And the book was a biography about Cleopatra's daughter. And here's the amazing part. That biography started my writing career. My very first historical fiction novel was about Cleopatra's daughter. And so there was Beatrice Chandler, the same Beatrice Chandler, sitting up on my bookshelf watching over me. She's my little writing genie. If everyone has a writing angel or an inspiration, mine is Beatrice. And she was just waiting for me to discover her story and all the incredible things that she'd done in her life. So I was so delighted by that. And then I knew, like maybe this story I was meant to tell it. And so I still feel that way. I'm not really a woo-woo person. I don't really believe in ghosts or anything like that. But if there were any spirits who could come back from the afterworld and inspire other women, it'd be Beatrice.
Okay. Well, I was wondering, with
Mhm.
the information that you dug up, wasn't Adrian's family wealthier than Lafayette's or
To
higher
begin
standard?
with, yes, the Lafayettes themselves were lesser nobility. They were sort of country bumpkins. They lived in Auvergne, far away from court. And the Noailles were probably the most prominent French family at court. They were very powerful and influential. But Lafayette's maternal grandfather was super wealthy too. And it just so happened that it was a series of familial deaths that resulted in, our country bumpkin inheriting a giant fortune. So suddenly, he went from, you can't say rags to riches, but certainly from being a bumpkin to being very wealthy, wealthy enough that the Noai of all people, of all families, would
Mhm.
consider him a good choice as a husband for one of their daughters.
Okay. Yeah, I thought I had read that, but I wasn't sure.
Yeah.
Okay, we have a question here from Gail.
Mhm.
Your research and attitude are both wonderful. Thanks for
Oh,
writing this book, which I look forward to reading. How can we tell what is written is true or fictional? That quandary has always been an issue for me with historical fiction. Um, then
yeah, oh, go ahead.
it says, what is real history versus what is fiction? And are the names you use in the books real names or fictional names? Thank you.
This is a great question. For me, I always include a very lengthy author's note at the end of the book. And I confess to, my sins. What did I move? What did I change? What was real? What's not real? The first thing you should know is if you read something in one of my books that seems absolutely crazy, like, say, a man throwing his wooden leg across a restaurant, that will be true because I would not have the audacity to make something like that up. So the crazier it is, I assure you that's real. Um, but in historical fiction, most of us will write lengthy author's notes, and you can be able to find the difference between fact and fiction. I would say that oftentimes we have to make up conversations between people because we might know that a conversation took place, but we don't know exactly what was said. And so historical fiction writers, we have to put that in dialogue. So I would be suspicious of I wouldn't quote any dialogue from a historical fiction book as being true for sure. Now, one of the devices that I use is that when I'm writing dialogue for any of my characters, if I have letters that exist from them, I try to use the wording from their letters to communicate what they are saying in scene. This way, they're still using their own words. So I like to bring that voice to life. And fortunately, Beatrice Chandler in The Women of Chateau Lafayette, she had a lot of letters and they were very funny. And so if you see funny lines in my book or Beatrice is talking, they're almost always hers. She was a delightful, hilarious person. So I was very fortunate to have that. And I also pulled in Adrian's words from her letters. Now, Marta, she, as I said, she's a fictional character. So, but she's based on a real person. So if you go to the back of my book, you'll see an explanation of that and, why I picked her name. Otherwise, the people who are in the books, they were real people. Very rarely will I insert a fictional character of any note, unless it's, guard number two or the doorman, or if I have to make up something like that, that might be a fictional person. But otherwise, no. And for me, I have written historical fiction ranging from the ancient world to the Revolution to most recently, I wrote about Frances Perkins, who was our first cabinet secretary, our first female cabinet secretary in the United States, and that's set in the 1930s. And I have to make a decision a lot of times about how much liberty I really could or should take with someone. And if it's a figure that's still very relevant in our political discourse, like say Thomas Jefferson, we can never stop arguing about Thomas Jefferson. Um, I want to be very accurate about that because I don't want to introduce any falsehoods into the national narrative. And so for Founding Father, I'm going to adhere very closely to the historical record. I have been up at night sweating about whether or not it was okay to move a headache that Jefferson had in France by just a week. But I needed to make it, the chapters fit. So I moved the headache and I put it in the author's note. But when it comes to somebody like, say, Emperor Augustus, who lived 2,000 years ago and really doesn't ever come up in our political debates, I feel like that's free game. I I feel a lot freer to I'm sorry, I should have said fair game. I feel a lot freer to do whatever I want with a historical character like that. I mean, he got to be emperor, so if I malign him, I don't feel that bad about it. So those are the kinds of considerations that I bring to historical fiction. Every author is going to have their own line in the sand that they won't cross, but those are mine.
Okay. Amy wrote, do the Marquis relations still live in the chateau? It says here, he stayed in a house a block from me on his Grant return tour.
Ah, that is wonderful. Um, So his family members are not living at the chateau in Chavignac, but there is a second um, family estate that they have, which is Lagrange, and it's closer to Paris. And that was Adrian inherited that. That was her house. And so there are family members of Lafayette still living there, not at Chavignac, which is now a museum. But I did have this most amazing experience this last summer, and that was that three of the women descendants of Lafayette, they came to New York City to help kick off the farewell tour, and I got to meet them and present them with a copy of The Women of Chateau Lafayette. And I'm still aglow from that meeting, and I thought I really am going to faint. I'm shaking the hand of one of his descendants, and they are carrying on his legacy just like the women in my book. They're still keeping that torch lit for the legacy of their ancestors. And I found it, even just talking about it right now, I'm getting verklempt.
Okay. Can you tell our viewers where they can purchase your book?
Yes. My books are available wherever books are sold. You can find them on Amazon. You can find them in bookstores. I love independent bookstores, so definitely do that. Also, they come in audio, so if you're an Audible fan, go there. And please do visit my website, which is stephaniedray.com, and sign up for my VIP newsletter because I send it out once a month and you get free book reviews of other historical fiction, and I give away books every single month. And it's the best way to keep in touch with me and also keep track of what books I'm writing and what new Lafayette things I'm involved in, and also when my next books are coming out.
Okay. All right. What final message would you like to share regarding Lafayette and or the women who lived at the chateau?
I guess I would reiterate something I'd said during my talk, which is that we are all part of the Lafayette legacy right now as we're doing this webinar, and we should behave accordingly. So I try to remember his example and her example and how to meet the modern moments. And I hope that all of the readers and listeners who are watching us now will do the same.
Well, thank you for all of that this evening, Stephanie. And I look forward to trying to get my hands on the book and taking
Yay.
time to read it.
All right. Mwah.
Stephanie, thanks so much for your exceptional presentation this evening. Your program has been recorded and will be made available later for our YouTube channel, Lafayette 200 Marquis Mondays. We hope all of you attending this evening enjoyed the Marquis Monday and invite you to enjoy and attend our next and last program in this season, which takes place on Monday, June 30th, with author Tom Chafin, who wrote Revolutionary Brothers, Thomas Jefferson, the Marquis de Lafayette, and the friendship that helped forge two nations. And with that, until then, bonsoir. Good night, everyone.